Okay, good morning again. We'll just briefly recap what we discussed yesterday. We, of course, are looking at the prophetic spans, looking to see where we can, looking to see where we can identify the fulfillment of prophecy. And we've gone through a number already. Of course, we've gone through 1529, the Diet of Spies, and the Siege of Vienna. And we went through 1868, the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. Yesterday, we spent our time looking at the 220, which is Napoleon being installed as a dictator, the coup of 18 Brumaire. And we made the point that Napoleon being installed as dictator in 1799, it's not an event that happened in a vacuum. It was part of a broader history, the history of the French Revolution, which we identified as a 10-year history, right? And when you look at the French Revolution, what it was fundamentally was the overthrowing of an established order and the putting in place of a new order, right? The monarchy was overthrown and it was replaced by the French Republic with Napoleon as first consul, right? When you look at the antitype, we have Trump being typified by Napoleon, and in 2019, he is the dictator that is put in place. But we want to identify it as part of a broader history, which we said is the history of the American Revolution. This American Revolution, we mark from 9/11, beginning at 9/11, and what it is, just like the French Revolution, is the overthrowing of an established order and the putting in place of a new one. We discussed what is the established order in the United States, right? And we described it as, the Constitution, right? Liberal principles. The principles, strong institutions, division of powers, egalitarianism, all people are equal before the law, human rights, right? All these are liberal principles and they're all enshrined in the Constitution. So from 9/11, with the Patriot Act, we're seeing the beginning of the overthrowing of this established order. And we asked ourselves the question, what is the new order that is replacing it? It's nationalism and authoritarianism, or dictatorship, as was stated yesterday. And we read a number of news articles which essentially confirmed the fundamental points that we were making, that you can trace a decline in this constitutional order of the United States. You can trace its decline from 9/11. And when we come to 2019, we asked ourselves, do we see Trump acting as a dictator in 2019? And we said, yes, we did. We read articles which identified his complete sort of dictatorial takeover of the Republican Party. It's complete as of 2019. And this is evidenced in the zero opposition that he faces, the 100% loyalty that he enjoys from his own party, right? We also see it within the United States, right? Because we looked at what is the definition of a dictator. It is someone who rules, we said basically it's someone who rules without constitutional restraint. It is someone who rules without limits to their power. And we know that the division of powers, the office of the executive, which is the presidency in the United States, its power is limited, right? The president is not a king. Its power is limited by the Constitution, and it shares power. Power is divided between the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. But we read examples of how Trump has no regard for the authority of the legislature, and he ignores them at will. He's acting without He's thrown off the constitutional restraints placed upon him. He's thrown off the limits of his power. He's thrown off the limits of his power that are delineated within the Constitution. And that is fundamentally a dictator. That's what a dictator is, someone who operates without legal or constitutional restraint. So, again, with 1799, Napoleon being established as a dictator at the end of the French Revolution, we do see a fulfillment of this in 2019. If we look and we're willing to connect we're willing to connect the history that we've recently gone through, the external history, the news, with the symbols with the symbols seen within the type. Okay. So that was that. That's where we left off. There's one I want to look at, which is 110. And 110 is half of 220. And this takes you to 1909. Right. Did we get to look at this one, 126? Did folks manage to look at it? Yes? No? No. Okay, let's go on to this one here. 110. What happened in 1909? What happened in 1909? Yes. Okay. So this is the last general conference attended by Ellen White. My brother points out she was 81 years of age at the time. So I have a few paragraphs. I should have put the full name of this book. I think it's in the White Estate, in the autobiographical section, or in the biography section, and it's WV 508. WV page 508. Beginning at page 508. If someone has their White Estate, maybe you could find the reference. Okay. It says, so this is speaking about the 1909 General Conference, and it goes up to page 509. It's basically pages 508 to 509. I'll just read specific portions. It says, from 508 paragraph 6, as in 1905, this General Conference session was held in a large tent pitched on the grounds of Washington Missionary College. The opening meeting convened at 10:45 a.m. Thursday, May 13th. There were 328 delegates present, a number that swelled a little as the conference progressed. The session itself was quite routine, with a great deal of time given over to reports of the progress of the cause around the world. A portion of each day was devoted to individual meetings of the various departments and to the business of the quadrennial session. Sabbath morning, May 15, at 11, Ellen White addressed the session in the big tent. The bulletin reported that it was a day long to be remembered, as the aged servant of God stood in that large tent speaking to an audience of more than 1,000 people. She seemed to lay upon those assembled representatives of the third angel's message the importance of rightly representing Christ to the world in our speech, in our character, in all our dealing with our fellow men, in order that we shall not be found fruitless in the great day of harvest. She spoke 11 times in the big tent, taking the Sabbath morning services on 3 of the 4 Sabbaths of the session. How did the voice of this little woman of 81 come through to the audience? And it goes on. So it makes a few points about what they did. Time was given to reports on the progress of the course from around the world. An emphasis of her teaching was, it says, the importance of rightly representing Christ to the world in our speech, in all our dealings with our fellow men. It's dealing with the principles of how people were to interact with one another, right? She spoke about health reform extensively. And yeah, I don't see any other points that I want to pull out. Okay, so Ellen White, she attends her last GC session. She never attended another one after that. She preached on various subjects, health reform, city evangelism, but an emphasis of her teaching was also the principles upon which brethren dealt with one another, right? The principles upon which brethren related to one another. Do we have any thoughts on the significance of this, right? So it's 110 years, taking you to 2019, 110 being half of 220. What are our thoughts? Yes.
To me, I was seeing how I can connect what happened that 1909 with what happened in 2019. And then what I just tried to think is that Ellen G. White was a prophetess, and she was also the third messenger, if I'm not mistaken, and she was giving the message of that time to those people. And also I tried to marry to the rise of the coming up of the midnight cry message in our time. That was also given by the lady that is the test, and also like that messenger. That is what I was trying to bring it up, because I want to know the uniqueness of how we are tying the 1909 and 2019.
So my brother's drawing some parallels. He's identifying that in 1909 there's a prophetess, right? Who he's also identifying as the messenger of the third angel. And then in 2019, he's identifying that there is a prophetess again, right? Who's also giving the third angel's message, who's also the messenger of the third angel. So he's drawing those parallels. right? And he's left us there. Does anyone have any more to add? Any thoughts? Dickens?
Yeah, what we can, what I'm trying to see in the point that you have read, I know there are much that this one is beyond the scope of what was taking place in the year, but as we see, she was emphasizing in some of the principles, like the principle how we should be dealing with our fellow men. We should see, like in 2019, such kind of development where the message about equality comes and begin to affect our own understanding, how we should relate in our family, how we should relate with the women, and how we should uplift them. So I will try to see that the same principle she was pushing forth then is like the same principle that we see under the development of the United Finance.
Mm-hmm. That's a key point. So he's adding the detail that in 1909, an emphasis of her teaching was the principles of how brethren were to relate to one another. And then in 2019, we have a message being opened up that becomes the focus and the test. And it's relating to how brethren deal with one another, right? The subject of equality, right? Race, gender, right? It's the same theme of how brethren are to interact with one another in a manner so as to have Christ's approval. So that's another parallel. Any other thoughts or additions? So we're seeing parallels, but I'm sure there are more. Any other thoughts? Benjamin?
I'm not sure. Is it in 2019 when the reports all over the world
Okay. There was that document, the World Mission Report. That was produced by Futures Now, the German ministry. Was it released in 2019? I think it was. Because something that was given time to at the session was the updates from around the world, right? What does it say? It says reports of the progress of the course from around the world.
and the German conference?
Okay, I think that's the key thing, right? Because what is a GC session? It's a meeting of delegates from around the world, right? And when we look at 2019, did the movement have a GC session? Yes, it did. And it was in Germany, where we had representatives attending from around the world. So we have a GC session in 1909 in the Adventist Church. We have a GC session in the movement in 2019. In 1909, a great deal of time was given over to reports of the progress of the cause from around the world. And I think we can say the same for 2019. A lot of time was given. We had many meetings with ministries from around the world, giving reports of the progress and discussing the way forward for the work in different parts of the world. So there's that parallel. Equality was emphasized at our GC session, right? Equality was an emphasis, but specifically from the perspective of organization, right? What does equality look like within the context of organization? That was something that was being emphasized, the principles upon which brethren within ministry organizations and so on, the principles upon which they were to operate. What does equality look like in a ministry, in a national board, right? And in a school setting, right? That was a subject of emphasis. And so I'm saying we're drawing those parallels. And then what else do we see? What other Any other parallels you can draw? Yes.
Is the last one the NFA with a 10? Although I know how we just don't there, but there were representatives of FFA then. That's the last one there with a 10 as the voice of the movement in that sense. Like they were representative of the movement. That's their last one. Something like that.
Yeah. I guess, like, for example, if you look at what happened in 1909, you see Ellen White never returns to the General Conference, right? And one can suggest that symbolically what you see, there's a separation. You see a separation, looking at it symbolically, not drawing on the moral aspect of it, She was simply retiring, you know what I mean? But what you see there is the prophet separating from the leaders. There's a separation between the prophet and the leaders from which she never returns after that. So my thought is that, there's a parallel that we can see with our GC session, which happened in Germany, right? Because it was there that we see Future for America, the split between the third angel's messenger and the leaders, right? Future for America, who were leaders, and you have the prophetess, the messenger of the third angel. There's a separation that takes place between them. In 1909, the separation that takes place between them in 2019. Now, I guess, Emma, you're suggesting that, Ellen White is the leader, then FFA, and she separates, and FFA were the leadership, and they separate. But my thought is, I would think it would probably be more accurate to suggest that, because Ellen White, she was the prophetess. She was the messenger of the Lord.
I was thinking that too. I'm just thinking of how the last one she attends, and this is the last one they're attending.
Okay.
In that sense, but yeah.
So I think in that we can draw parallels. We see the last General Conference Ellen White attended. We see the themes that some of the themes that were discussed at that conference session being reflected in Germany in 2019. And we see a symbolic separation, right, between the prophetess and the leaders. And in 2019, we see a symbolic separation between the two movements, the one which is led by the prophetess, the messenger, the third angel, and the other leaders. So from that perspective, 1909 is reflecting a development that's internal to this movement. And I think we can see it. I think that makes sense. It looks tight. It looks tight to me. Do you have any thoughts or additions to that one? My sister, you look very... Any thoughts? No? Does it make sense? Yes? Okay.
Because I think that they all of them are prophets, and okay, Sister Tess is a prophetess, and also Elder Smith is a prophet, right? Then, what do you mean by him being a leader? And when they were also Sister Tess is a leader.
Well, I think... Was Jeff still a prophet? Is Jeff still a prophet? He was a prophet, but is he still a prophet? In the sense that, is he the messenger for this time?
I think he's a full prophet now.
You still think he is a prophet? Or he's a false prophet? I think you work with the symbols that are given in the type, right? The type is not giving you two classes of prophets. The type is giving you a group of leaders and a prophetess, right? And I think we are to work with the symbols given in the type and not try to bring in not try to bring in symbols from that are not provided within the model that we're within the type or parable that we're looking at, right? So, you know, yes, you can say we have a true prophet and a false prophet. That's correct, but that's not what this line is presenting us with, right? It's presenting us with leaders and a prophet, and within the context of those symbols, what is that teaching us? Right.
So what is speaking that is a quote.
What? What?
It's like you're saying that according to the context of the quote, is the prophetess and the leader.
Yes.
So we have to also come and take this one as leaders and let prophetess.
Yes. Make sense? Any other thoughts? Yes, sir?
Originally, when we found this 81, it was a symbol of the priests that had gathered to stop the apostasy. So I don't know if you want to make a link there of some kind of 81 is a symbol of the priests that had gathered, maybe in 2019, because we're marking that closing invasion of the priests. I'm not sure. Just throw it out there.
Yes, I mean, it was in Holland in 2000 and what? Was that 2016? 2016, 17. When Parminder gave studies, Elder Parminder gave studies looking at this general conference session and pulling out all the symbols to show how it was typifying what referred to as midnight at the time. Right, and yeah, I mean, we made much moment of 81. I don't know how we would use it now. But we did identify 81 as a symbol of midnight, which today would be 2019. That's how it was applied then. Anyone with any thoughts on that? 81. Yeah. So do we see fulfillment? I think we do. I think that one is quite clear to see when all the symbols are accounted for. Now, the next one I want to cover is 81. 81 years before 2019. Where does that take you? 1938. What happened in 1938? The night of broken glass. What was the night of broken glass? What was the night of broken glass? Yes.
It was Hitler gives authority to the Nazi people, the German people, to persecute the Jews.
Yes, it was the turning point. It was the turning point in violent persecution against the Jews. Right? There'd been increasing tensions and hostilities. Right? The Jews had come under increasing, worse and worse racism. But Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, was the point at which that persecution actually started to become violent. Right? So, I just have a few paragraphs from the Wikipedia entry for Kristallnacht. It says, Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, also called November Pogrom, was a pogrom against Jews carried out by SA paramilitary forces and civilians throughout Nazi Germany on 9 to the 10th of November 1938. The German authorities looked on without intervening. The name Kristallnacht or Crystal Night comes from the shards of broken glass that littered the streets after the windows of Jewish-owned stores, buildings, and synagogues were smashed. Jewish homes, hospitals, and schools were ransacked as the attackers demolished buildings with sledgehammers. The rioters destroyed 267 synagogues throughout Germany, Germany, Austria, and the Sudetenland. Over 7,000 Jewish businesses were damaged or destroyed, and 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and incarcerated in concentration camps. British historian Martin Gilbert wrote that no event in the history of German Jews between 1933 and 1945 was so widely reported as it was happening, as the accounts from foreign journalists working in Germany sent shockwaves around the world. The pretext of the attacks was the assassination of the Nazi German diplomat Ernst von Rath by Herschel Greenspan, a 17-year-old German-born Polish Jew living in Paris. Estimates of fatalities caused by the attacks have varied. Early reports estimated that 91 Jews had been murdered. Modern analysis of German scholarly sources puts the figure much higher, when deaths from post-arrest maltreatment and subsequent suicides are included. The death toll climbs into the hundreds, with Richard J. Evans estimating 638 suicide deaths. Historians view Kristallnacht as a prelude to the final solution and the murder of 6 million Jews during the Holocaust. Right, so the Night of Broken Glass, the turning point in violent persecution against the Jews. That was November 9, 1938. So this is another November 9. So when we bring it down to 2019, what does that look like? What does that look like in 2019? You have the Jewish state, you have the German state, and you have the Jews, a minority within the German state, and you have persecution, an escalation of persecution. Right? What does all of that look like in 2019? Yes?
Can I say that separation of those people from Mexico when they reach border, they have to do the separation of the children and
Well, you're making application, but maybe the symbols. Who is the German state? What do Jews look like today?
okay,
You know.
I'd say that Germany is a symbol of United States of America,
Okay.
and then the foreigners who are entering America are compared with the Jews, or the Jews symbolizes the Mexican or other foreigners who are entering.
Why?
Okay, because they are not the, you can say that they are not the native. They are coming to search for good life or where they can flourish economically.
Okay. Because I guess the thought is we're saying the Jews are the immigrants,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And you know, what is the characteristics that of the Jews that allows us to draw that parallel? Oh, he said that the German state is the United States in the application, and that the Jews represent the Mexicans and immigrants. So I asked the question as to why. What is the characteristic of the Jews that allows us to draw that parallel to say that it represents the immigrants?
Can I clarify why we make Germany United States? Is the reason because we're teaching World War II is king of the North, we're saying America's king of the North? Is that how we establish?
Is it?
I'm asking.
Does someone have any thoughts on that? Why do we say Germany is the United States?
So I think, as Dama is trying to clarify, we always equate Hitler to Donald Trump. So when Hitler is the king of Germany, so Trump, if Hitler is Trump, then Germany becomes USA. That's what we do. We always do that when we are hitting World War II.
World War II?
Yeah. Then I think some other thoughts I had about when we make the migrants. I would not necessarily say all migrants, because Donald Trump has no problem with migrants who are coming from some countries that are, well, first-class countries. He has problems with third world countries, more so Latin American and African nations. And one thing I know about Hitler is that he began having the hate for the Jewish when he was a foot soldier in the World War I. So even before World War I think I've seen some documentary about Hitler himself, where he always had this hate that the Jewish always came to Germany and they lived good lives, whereas German people were suffering. Even when Germany was fighting in World War I, the Jewish could not come and help them fight. So when he becomes president, he has this hate for the Jewish. He believes they always come to their nation and they are living good lives and making life harder for the Germans. So if I would buy that principle, I would have the same argument for Donald Trump. He believes these immigrants are coming, they are coming to United States, they are having jobs, and they are stealing jobs from Americans and making them have a difficult lifestyle.
Okay. So you're drawing parallels between the situation of the Jews in Germany with the situation of, immigrants, right? So you have a minority that's being persecuted by the state, right? That's what the Jews were. So now when you come, if you're going to look within the United States, you must see a minority that's being persecuted by the state, right? That's what we should see in 2019. And then I guess you're drawing the characteristic that how the Jews were regarded, like they were coming and taking opportunities from the indigenous sort of Germans. And today, immigrants are viewed in much the same light, that they're viewed as coming and, the Jews were viewed as being parasitic, that they would take for themselves, what belongs to the Germans and so on. And really, if you look at the rhetoric that's coming out of Trump's movement, it's really the same, When you say, they're just criminals and rapists and they just come and take, they're parasitic, right? So you see the parallels, with regards to how Jews were regarded within the context of Germany and how immigrants are regarded within the context of Trump's America, right? Does that make sense? Oh. Yeah.
Sometimes they are addressing the Kristallnacht as if it's Holocaust.
Uh-huh.
And they address Holocaust in some difference between how they apply Holocaust and the Kristallnacht.
Yeah, Kristallnacht was a turning point in violent persecution which led to the Holocaust, but they're not the same thing.
But when people address them
In application, people.
you can hear from what they're saying, they are actually addressing Kristallnacht, but they're addressing the Holocaust.
Okay.
Because like in the Holocaust, you find Hitler separating children from their parents and taking them to concentration camps.
Yes.
But you find like when you're addressing very Kristallnacht, people are almost speaking to this and that.
Okay.
So that's why it was important the question you asked. We identify the symbols we're using and how we are applying them.
Yes.
To be sure that we're using the Kristallnacht to make an application to Kristallnacht.
Yes.
So
Okay, so he's making the point that in how people, from how folks are saying it, in their application, they seem to conflate Kristallnacht with the Holocaust. Because in the Holocaust, Hitler separated children from their parents and put them in concentration camps in the Holocaust. And then there's a tendency to, sorry, I didn't say it as well, but people conflate the two things. And in our application, we must be careful, not to do that. In our application of the symbols, we must be clear about what we're referring to. Continue.
So, but when you were reading that, so there's a hatred that has been developed against the Jews in Europe. And this hatred, in fact, does not come in the time period of Hitler. If you read the history, it comes down from the history of Christ. The time they say, let his blood
upon us and our children, and they were killing them.
So my brother's pointing out that, when you look at the hatred of the Jews in Germany, it's not something that developed in that history. He's arguing that it's something that goes back to the time of Christ, when the Jews said, let his blood be upon us.
Yeah. I was reading that this is conspiracy theory that really has come down from the Christian age and has gone through Europe. And even, I think Hitler began to learn of this when he was a young child in academy. His professor used to speak so badly about the Jews. So they were being given this kind of education which portrayed Jews as bad people who are taking all the opportunities in Germany, and not only in Germany but in the whole of Europe. And very soon they will take over Europe and white people will become a minority.
Yeah, so you're saying Hitler received an education in these, an indoctrination, maybe call it, in these type of ideas from his school-going years, where Jews were present, they killed Christ. There's that thing that the Jews killed the Messiah, and they were presented as bad people, and he's taking in these ideas, but they were ideas that came from way back, and the slander or the conspiracy theory against the Jews was the idea that they were going to take over Europe, and then white people or European white people would become the minority within their own countries. Yep.
And if you look, there's someone in your brain that killed the ambassador of Germany in France.
Greenspan, yeah.
And they want to use this as a pretext to begin attacking the Jews in Germany.
Uh-huh.
So if I take this and apply it, it's the case where you see by migrants are being touched with issues like crime, rape in the United States.
Right, so my brother's making the point that, the Kristallnacht, what was used, the assassination of a German politician by a Jew was used as a pretext to begin, I guess, the persecution of the Jews.
So you have all these bad issues happening in the United States,
Mhm.
and they're being placed upon the heads of the immigrants.
Yeah. So in the United States, in the type you're seeing, in the same way the Jews were blamed for all the problems in Germany, and further in Europe as well. In the United States, you have immigrants who are being blamed for all the problems in society, that they're bringing crime, and so on. Yeah.
And then, so you see that this is going to be the cause and the effect is the Trump administration is going to put in place oppressive policies
Mhm.
against the immigrants.
All right. So the cause is the accusation, and then the result is Trump is going to put in oppressive policies against immigrants.
And if you look at the way that you say the conspiracy theory about the Jews had begun to spread way back, the issues about migrants being rapists and gangsters and crime were already being advocated way before Trump comes into office.
Yeah, that's an important point. He says as the conspiracy theories about the Jews did not come into existence in the time of Nazi Germany. They came from before. Even with immigrants, the negative propaganda against immigrants is not something that came in Trump's time. It's something that's been there in the United States for a long time. So, and then it results in oppressive policies being enacted against the immigrants. In the same way, the Night of Broken Glass, you're seeing now oppression is being enacted against the Jews, right? Does that make sense? So the question then is, do we see that in 2019? That's the question. Do we see oppressive policies being enacted against immigrants in 2019 by the Trump administration? Right? I think we do. I think we know we do. If you've been following. I just have a few passages here from news sources. Now, this is a very useful document I'm about to share. It's basically a timeline. A timeline is from PBS. the American news outlet PBS. And the article is called A Guide to Some Major Trump Administration A Guide to Some Major Trump Administration Immigration Policies. So it's a news article off the PBS website. And what it is, it's essentially tracing, it's a timeline of Trump's policies on immigration from when he came into office right up until last year. And it highlights the different ones. It says like travel ban, you know, the policy was the travel ban. Then it states what happened, describes what happened. Refugee admissions, his policy on refugee admissions, and it states what happened. Shifting asylum policies, and it states what happened. So it's a very useful article because it presents like a chronological timeline. But I'll just read portions of it. Oh, and in its opening paragraph, it makes reference to a documentary on Trump and immigration, a documentary by Frontline. Frontline is part of PBS. And this documentary is called Zero Tolerance. And it's a documentary about Trump's immigration policies, how he's cracking down, how he's really cracking down on immigration and refugees and so on and so forth. So this is an article, this is a documentary. But just reading portions from the article, you remember Trump issued a travel ban against Muslims. You remember that's one of the first things that he did when he came into power. So it says travel ban, what happened? The first travel ban, issued January 27, 2017, denied entry to nationals from 7 countries for 90 days and suspended all refugee admissions for 120 days while a review of the screening process was carried out. Critics noted that the ban, which cited terrorism threats, primarily targeted Muslim-majority countries. Key parts of it were put on hold nationwide by federal district judge on February 3, 2017. The judge wrote that residents would be adversely affected in employment, education, business, family relations, and freedom to travel, and harms were significant and ongoing, right? So it was clear that this travel ban, it was going to affect these people, these immigrants, severely, which is why portions of it were put on hold. So we have that was in January 27, 2017. On refugee admissions, it says what happened. The executive order that announced the first travel ban in January 2017 also suspended the refugee admission program for 120 days and called for a review of the screening and admission process. It also lowered the admission ceiling, which President Barack Obama had set at 110,000 for fiscal year 2017 to 50,000. Since then, President Trump has set the cap for refugee admissions at lower and lower levels, right? Obama had allowed for a cap of 110,000 refugees annually to come to the United States. Now Trump has lowered it lower and lower to the point where right now America is receiving almost no refugees today. Then it says on shifting asylum policies, the Trump administration has undertaken several measures to restrict the flow of asylum seekers at the US-Mexico border and limit who qualifies for asylum. But two of the most consequential ones went into effect this year. The Migrant Protection Program, the Migrant Protection Protocols, also referred to as Remain in Mexico, require those seeking entry at the southern border, including asylum seekers, to wait in Mexico until their day in court, rather than wait in the US. The Department of Homeland Security cast the policy as a way to restore a safe and orderly immigration process, reduce fraud, and protect vulnerable populations from being exploited by smugglers and traffickers. It was launched in January, but also faced legal challenges. And it goes on. Another major change came in July with a rule that barred anyone from claiming asylum in the US if they first crossed through another nation and failed to apply for asylum there. I'll read that again. It says, another major change came in July with a rule that barred anyone from claiming asylum in the US if they first crossed another nation and failed to apply for asylum there, with some exceptions. The measure would effectively block all asylum seekers at the southern border except Mexicans. Then there was his zero tolerance policy, which was in the spring of 2018. So it says, in spring 2018, then Attorney General Jeff Sessions announced a zero tolerance policy, warning that everyone who crossed the southern border illegally would be referred for criminal prosecution. It says, during a pilot of this policy carried out the year before Sessions announced it, the administration said the number of families trying to cross declined by 64%, attributing the drop to prosecutions. Right, so zero tolerance and family separation, that was in the spring of 2018. Right, so you can draw a timeline of Trump's immigration policies as they've grown more oppressive, right? More oppressive with time. Now, when we look at, there's one more article, this one's specific to 2019. This article, it's from CBS News. And the article, the title is 2019. The year Trump (2019), the year Trump effectively shut off asylum at the border. And restricted immigration. Right, so I'll just read a portion of this article. So it says, it's referencing a journalist called Lee Gellernd. Lee Gellernd has spent much of 2019 crisscrossing federal courts across the country, trying to halt some of the Trump administration's most controversial immigration policies. As the top immigration litigator at the American Civil Liberties Union, Gellernd is accustomed to high-stakes legal fights with different administrations. But in the past 12 months, the veteran civil rights lawyer has been going toe-to-toe with what he described as a relentless slew of radical proposals. The administration has literally every month enacted new fundamental restrictions on the rights of immigrants, and in particular, the rights of asylum seekers at the border. The past year has arguably been the Trump administration's most successful one in its quest to restrict asylum at the US-Mexico border, overhaul the nation's legal immigration system, crack down on undocumented immigrants, alter America's status as a safe haven for refugees, and challenge decades of bipartisan consensus that robust immigration is key to America's economic and social prosperity. So, of course, the article goes into more detail, but the point is clear that, it's identifying, 2019 is the year that he has achieved the greatest success in shutting off asylum at the border and restricting, twisting the screws on immigrants, right? Making life harder for immigrants. It says, the past year has arguably been the Trump administration's most successful one in its quest to restrict legal asylum and overhaul the nation's legal immigration system, right? Not to make it easier, but to make it harder, life harder as an immigrant in the United States, right? That as an immigrant, if and it says every month, new and more restrictive measures were being introduced every month of 2019. Right. So now, when we come to the night of broken glass, again, we're seeing within the German state a persecution, right? Persecution of a hated minority group by the state, right? And we can draw the parallel, see that, the Jews were the subject of a history of propaganda against them, which the state began to act in response to. And when you come to 2019, you are seeing the same thing. You're seeing persecution of a hated minority, seeing persecution of immigrants by the state, by the government of the United States. And just as with the Jews, immigrants have been the subject of a lengthy propaganda campaign, mostly by conservatives in the United States, painting them as undesirable elements, right? So I think we see a parallel between the night of broken glass and the treatment and handling of immigration and immigrants by the Trump administration in 2019. Do we see that? Yes.
There's something I'm not sure about. But in 2019, there was an argument about that, and you know the program they were going to put in place.
Yes.
Program documented and migrants. There was an argument to end that program. I don't know how it ended.
Yeah. I mean, the immigration one, again, there was a period of time when I felt very regularly, almost like every week you're seeing something new that was being done to make life even harder for immigrants and asylum seekers. So this article says every month there was a new development, there was new policies being introduced. And of course, I haven't done the work. It's probably a worthwhile exercise to lay out the timeline of the policies that you see being laid out. This document just highlights a handful of key ones. And then, but if you're to see a timeline of it, if timeline were to produce, you could see month by month all these policies being introduced. And I remember that one about DACA. DACA was the children of, if you came in as an illegal immigrant and you have a child in the country, the child is born in the United States. What the parents did is not the child's fault. The child is born in the country, so the child should get American citizenship because they don't know any other country, right? So in the United States, they haven't been able to, those children would be undocumented. They wouldn't be legal in the country, right? Which presents many problems, getting jobs, going to school, and so on and so forth, because you don't have legal paperwork. You don't have a social insurance number, which is like a sort of ID, so you can't, life is very difficult. So Obama had put in place this program for a pathway to citizenship, right? That's so the children the children of these immigrants who are born in the United States, they can get citizenship, right? And now Trump was reversing that. He was trying to cancel that. I'm not sure how far he's gotten with it. So Emma, I'll come to you, but my sister?
I'll just answer that question quickly.
Okay. Sure.
It says this is an ongoing process that's been taking place, which has been since 2014. This DACA program.
Yes.
It's in September of 2019 that they're trying to, he's consistently before that tried to cancel this program, and court orders have ruled that you can't do it yet. So that there's this cycle going on over DACA. And in September 2019, the cancellation of the program was on hold by a court order, and a Supreme Court decision on the matter is not expected until 2020, so it's still in the balance.
Okay. All right. So DACA, the fight has been going on to cancel it, but right now there's a court order to prevent Donald Trump from going ahead and canceling it, and the Supreme Court is going to decide on whether he can cancel it or not this year in 2020. My sister? I get it, yes. Donald Trump has you're making the point that in the first quote that was read, the quote from this one here, that it points Trump's travel ban that he initiated when he came into power, that he banned people from Muslim countries. And you're making the point that Trump has a problem with Muslims. And I guess that's correct, but when you look at Muslims in America, yes, they are the Trump movement does not like them. They're hated, true. But where Muslims are there and they're American citizens, I don't think we're seeing them actively being persecuted by legislation at this point. They're hated and there's rhetoric against them, right? I even have a passage here where it's quoting Ilhan Omar, the Somali woman who's the congresswoman for Minnesota. Because in Minnesota, there are lots of Somalis who came as refugees. And now, they've settled their large Somali community in that city. How Trump was attacking her, at a rally, and which we don't want to repeat the things he was saying. So you see that there's definitely rhetoric, right? But I don't know if we see Muslims being persecuted as a matter of policy, laws being introduced to make life harder for Muslims in particular. Whereas if you look at the ban that he issued, it is a ban against immigrants, right? Immigrants from Muslim countries, fair enough, but immigrants being the fundamental point, I think. Do we see that? Right, this application. So I think what we're seeing is very interesting because after November 9, there were lots of people who started coming up and saying, what was fulfilled? What do we see? None of the things you predicted were fulfilled. But I think point by point, as we've gone through each of these prophetic spans, it takes work, it takes digging, but we do see the fulfillment, right? And we can give account for the things that we predicted, point by point, right? Again, we're saying that as we look back, we're going to receive more light on these things. We don't understand all of it. I certainly don't understand all of it. Again, this is a November 9. I as yet can't identify anything on the date of November 9 specifically, which constitutes the fulfillment of this prophecy. But if we look at the year November 9, we can definitely see it, right? And we can trust that as we go forward, more light will open up on these fulfillments, right? So I guess there are the prophetic spans that we haven't had opportunity to go through as yet, but I think we're out of time. So if we don't have any questions, points, thoughts, we can close with the word of prayer. Let's pray. Father in heaven, we thank you for your word, and we thank you for the fulfillment of prophecy, the testimony that your word is sure, that the things that you say will come to pass will of a certainty come to pass. May this strengthen our faith in this message, our faith in this movement. May this knowledge give tone and strength to our walks with you. That, Lord, we may be prepared to do the work that you're preparing us to do in this dispensation and in the dispensations to come. It's the day of preparation. Please guide us, help us to be ready for the Sabbath. And bless our time together, for we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.